2 days after I paid for my son's lavish wedding, my phone rang. It was the manager of the luxury restaurant where we held the reception. His voice was shaking so badly I could barely understand him. He said, "Mr. Gallagher, we were reviewing the security footage from the bridal suite. You need to come down here right now. Use the back alley entrance. And whatever you do, do not tell your wife." If you are just tuning into this story, take a deep breath, because what I am about to tell you is a nightmare I never thought I would experience in my own home from the people I loved most. Before I reveal what was on that tape, please hit the like button to support a father who had to learn the hardest lesson of his life, and tell me in the comments where you are watching from right now. My name is Harrison Gallagher, though everyone in the Pittsburgh steel business just calls me Harry. I am 70 years old. I spent 4 entire decades turning a tiny rusted metal shop into Gallagher Heavy Industries. My hands are rough, permanently calloused, and scarred from years of hauling heavy steel turbines and working double shifts so my family would never know the meaning of the word struggle. I made sure my wife Patricia lived like absolute royalty. I made sure my 35-year-old son Derek never had to lift a single heavy thing in his entire life. I gave them smooth, privileged lives, completely shielding them from the harsh realities of the world outside our gates. It was a Tuesday evening. The house was extremely quiet. I was sitting at my heavy oak desk in my private study, staring at a massive stack of catering and event invoices. I was holding my pen, writing out a final check for $300,000 to cover the remaining expenses for Derek's extravagant wedding to his new bride. It was an outrageous amount of money for a single weekend event, but I did not complain. He was my only son. I wanted him to have the absolute best start in his new life. I had just signed my name on the dotted line when my cell phone buzzed on the desk. I answered it, fully expecting a late business call from one of my plant supervisors. Instead, it was Martin Collins, the general manager of the Obsidian, the highly exclusive venue where we had hosted the wedding reception just 48 hours prior. Martin was usually a very composed, professional man who handled high society events with ease. But right now he was stammering. He sounded terrified. He begged me to come to the restaurant immediately. He specifically told me to park in the loading dock area in the back and to make sure Patricia did not know where I was going. My heart started to beat a little faster. You do not survive 40 years in the industrial manufacturing business without developing a sharp gut instinct. Something was horribly wrong. I walked out of my study. Patricia was in the living room humming a soft tune while arranging some leftover floral centerpieces from the wedding. She looked up at me with that perfect, practiced smile she always wore. She asked me where I was going so late in the evening. I lied smoothly, telling her there was a minor logistics emergency down at the shipping yard, and I needed to handle it personally. She walked over, kissed my cheek, her perfume smelling like roses and expensive vanilla, and told me not to work too late. The drive to the Obsidian took exactly 22 minutes, but it felt like hours. The streets of Pittsburgh were slick with fresh rain reflecting the streetlights like shattered glass. My windshield wipers beat back and forth in a hypnotic, steady rhythm, but my mind was racing out of control. Was Derek in some kind of legal trouble? Did someone steal from the venue? Had a wealthy guest been injured during the party? I played out a dozen terrible scenarios in my head, but none of them prepared me for the actual truth waiting for me in the dark. I pulled into the dark alley behind the restaurant and parked near the heavy metal dumpsters. Martin was already standing by the steel service door, looking left and right like a nervous animal. He did not say a word when he saw me. He just ushered me quickly inside, leading me through the busy, steaming kitchen and down a narrow concrete hallway into the basement security room. The room was incredibly small, smelling of ozone and old coffee. A wall of security monitors glowed brightly in the dim light. Martin locked the heavy door behind us. He looked at me with an expression of profound pity that made my stomach turn. He explained that a diamond bracelet had gone missing from the bridal suite during the reception, so he had been reviewing the hidden security cameras placed in the VIP rooms to ensure staff accountability. He said he did not find the bracelet, but he found something else. He reached out and clicked the computer mouse. One of the monitors expanded to fill the entire screen. It was black and white footage, but the audio feed was crystal clear. The timestamp at the bottom showed it was recorded at exactly 11 o'clock on the night of the wedding, right when the party outside was at its loudest peak. The camera was angled downward from the corner of the private bridal suite. I saw my son Derek pacing back and forth in his custom-tailored tuxedo. He was holding a glass of expensive champagne, but he did not look like a happy groom celebrating his wedding. He looked furious. Then Patricia walked into the frame. My wife of 38 years. The woman I had built my entire empire to protect and cherish. Derek slammed his glass down on the mahogany table. His voice was dripping with venom and deep resentment. He said the old man is too stubborn. He is never going to hand over the trust voluntarily. We just burned $300,000 on this pathetic wedding circus just to keep up appearances for his friends. When am I going to get full control of the accounts? I felt all the air leave my lungs. I physically leaned backward against the cold concrete wall of the security room, unable to believe what my own ears were hearing. My own son, the boy I loved more than my own life, was talking about me as if I were a stubborn, annoying obstacle standing in his way. But what Patricia said next froze the blood entirely in my veins. She walked over to Derek and calmly placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. Her face was completely devoid of emotion. It was an ice-cold, calculating mask that I had never once seen in our nearly 4 decades of marriage. She told him to relax and keep his voice down. Then she said it. She said, I have been lacing his evening bourbon with heavy sedatives for weeks. He is already losing his balance and complaining of brain fog. Tomorrow I will hand him the tax documents regarding the wedding expenses. You know he never reads the fine print when I hand him paperwork. Once he signs that irrevocable power of attorney, Dr. Sullivan will be at the house to evaluate his symptoms. He will declare him legally incompetent. By Friday morning, the transport van will arrive. He will be locked away securely in Sunny Pines Asylum, and the entire $150 million estate will be ours to control. I stopped breathing altogether. The small security room began to spin violently around me. Martin quickly grabbed my arm to steady me, offering me a rolling chair, but I could not bring myself to sit down. My eyes were completely glued to the glowing monitor. I watched my son, the boy I had carried on my shoulders through the park, the boy I had patiently taught to ride a bicycle, slowly smile. A greedy, terrifying, evil smile. He raised his champagne glass to his mother, and they clinked their flutes together, toasting to my absolute destruction. They were not just planning to steal my company. They were planning to completely erase me from society. They had bribed a corrupt doctor. They were systematically poisoning me with sedatives to make me appear mentally unstable to our friends and family. They were going to legally lock me in a psychiatric ward for the rest of my natural life, trapping me in a padded cell until I died, while they drained the massive empire I had bled every day to build. I turned and thanked Martin. I told him to copy the video file to a secure flash drive and to permanently delete the original recording from the restaurant server so no one else could ever find it. He nodded silently, terrified of being involved in our family nightmare, but completely compliant. He handed me the drive. I put the small piece of plastic in my coat pocket. It felt heavier than a block of solid iron. I walked back out into the rainy, cold alleyway. I got into my car and gripped the leather steering wheel so hard my knuckles turned a bright pale white. My vision blurred with hot tears of profound, agonizing grief. For 38 years, I had slept peacefully next to a predator. For 35 years, I had nurtured and funded a parasite. The devastation was absolute. It physically hurt my chest, a deep tearing pain that threatened to break my heart into a million pieces right there in the driver's seat. But then the grief burned away. It evaporated into the cold night air, instantly replaced by a quiet, calculating, and terrifying rage. If my wife and son thought I was just a senile, clueless old man who would blindly walk into his own grave, they were fatally wrong. You do not build a global steel empire by rolling over when you are viciously attacked in the dark. You survive by becoming more ruthless than your enemies. I wiped my eyes dry. I started the engine and drove back to my estate. I needed to act completely normal. I needed to play their sick game perfectly until I could spring my own deadly trap. I pulled into my long, sweeping driveway. The rain was coming down much harder now, washing over the manicured lawns. I parked the car and walked slowly up to the front marble steps. The porch light was glowing warmly in the dark, a beacon of false comfort. And there, waiting for me at the heavy wooden front door, was Patricia. She was wearing her soft cashmere robe, smiling with absolute chilling perfection. And in her hand she was holding a crystal glass of my favorite bourbon. The exact same bourbon she had just confessed on tape to poisoning. She held the glass out to me, her voice sweet and incredibly tender, and said, "Welcome home, darling. Drink up and get some rest. We have a very busy day tomorrow." She stood there on the marble steps, looking like the perfect, devoted wife. The warm porch light caught the amber liquid inside the crystal glass, making it glow. Just an hour ago, I would have seen this as a beautiful, thoughtful gesture from a caring partner. Now, knowing what she had just confessed on that security tape, the glass looked like a loaded weapon. My stomach churned violently with a toxic mixture of absolute disgust and sheer terror. But I knew I could not let my face betray a single emotion. I had to wear a mask just as flawless as hers. I forced a tired, appreciative smile and walked up the final few steps. I took the heavy crystal glass from her delicate hand. The cold glass chilled my fingers. She wrapped her other arm around my waist, leaning her head against my shoulder. She told me I worked far too hard for a man my age, and that I needed to start relaxing and letting the younger generation carry the heavy burdens. Every word was perfectly calibrated to sound loving, yet every word was dripping with venom. I thanked her, keeping my voice low and steady. I brought the glass up to my lips and tipped it back, letting the liquid touch my teeth, but I firmly kept my mouth closed. I faked a long swallow and let out a tired sigh. I told her it was exactly what I needed after dealing with the headache of shipping yard logistics. She beamed with satisfaction, her eyes tracking the supposedly half-empty glass. She turned around to unlock the heavy mahogany front door. The moment her back was facing me, I moved with a speed I had not used in years. I stepped sideways and silently poured the contents of the glass into the large potted fern sitting next to the welcome mat. By the time she pushed the door open and turned back to usher me inside, the glass was completely empty. I handed it back to her, thanking her for always knowing exactly what I needed. She took the glass, her smile widening into something that chilled me to the bone. For the record, that large, vibrant green fern, which had thrived on our porch for 3 years, was completely withered and dead by the following morning. The leaves turned a sickly, brittle brown. That was the exact poison she was putting into my body. We walked into the grand foyer. The house was quiet, smelling of expensive wax and fresh lilies. I took off my wet coat and hung it up, preparing to go upstairs and lock myself in my room to think. But before my foot even touched the first step of the grand staircase, the heavy oak doors of the library swung open. My son stepped out into the hallway. He was no longer wearing his furious, resentful expression from the videotape. Instead, he wore the bright, eager face of a dutiful, hard-working son. He was holding a thick manila folder crammed with documents. He walked over to me, clapping a hand on my shoulder with practiced affection. He said he was sorry to bother me so late, but his accountant had just called with an urgent matter. He claimed that if we signed these tax restructuring forms by 5 o'clock the next day, we could legally save 30% on the massive capital gains taxes generated by the wedding expenses. He spoke fast, using complex financial jargon, purposefully trying to overwhelm an exhausted, supposedly sedated old man. He told me he had already reviewed every single page and that I just needed to sign the bottom line so he could handle the rest. He handed me the thick stack of papers and a heavy gold fountain pen. I looked down at the documents. To the untrained eye, the top sheet looked exactly like a standard corporate tax declaration. But I had spent 40 years reading contracts designed to trap me. My eyes immediately caught the faint, legally binding watermark stamped onto the bottom corner of the page. It was not a tax document. It was an irrevocable power of attorney. If I signed my name on that dotted line, I would instantly surrender complete and total legal control of my personal finances, my healthcare decisions, and my entire global steel company over to him. It was the ultimate death warrant. My heart hammered against my ribs. I was cornered in my own hallway. If I refused to sign it, they would know I was suspicious. They knew I never turned down a chance to save money on taxes. If I pushed back, they might realize the sedatives were not working. They could easily resort to physical violence or simply hold me down and force a stronger lethal dose of poison down my throat right then and there. I was a 70-year-old man alone in a house with 2 predators. I had to sign it, but I also knew the strict bylaws of my own corporation. 40 years ago, when I first incorporated Gallagher Heavy Industries, I implemented an ironclad security clause regarding my signature. For any transfer of executive power to be legally binding, my signature had to match my official bank records exactly, and it absolutely had to include my middle initial. Furthermore, I am strictly right-handed. I took a slow, deep breath, channeling every ounce of acting ability I possessed. I reached out to take the gold pen, but I deliberately let my right hand begin to shake violently. I caused my fingers to spasm, dropping the heavy pen onto the hardwood floor with a loud clatter. I gasped, grabbing my right wrist with my left hand, putting on a show of genuine panic and pain. I looked at my wife and told her my hand was cramping terribly. I said my fingers felt completely numb, and I could not close my grip. Patricia stepped forward quickly. Her eyes darted to my son, a flash of genuine concern crossing her face. Not concern for my health, but concern that her heavy sedatives were working a little too fast and might ruin the signature they desperately needed. She rubbed my arm and told me to take my time, whispering that the medication must be making me a little fatigued. I apologized to my son, playing the role of a frustrated, aging father whose body was failing him. I told him I did not want to miss the tax deadline because of a stupid muscle cramp. So I bent down, picked up the gold pen with my non-dominant left hand, and awkwardly pinned the thick folder against the hallway wall. I gripped the pen tightly with my left hand. I dragged the gold nib across the thick paper, scribbling a messy, legally invalid signature, deliberately omitting my middle initial. Patricia and Derek exchanged a triumphant look. Derek slipped the paper into his briefcase. "Rest up, Dad. I will take care of the company tomorrow." I slowly smiled back at him, knowing the war had just begun. The sun came up, casting long shadows across our sprawling bedroom. I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that security footage replaying in my mind. I saw my son laughing at my destruction. I forced myself out of bed. My bones ached from the profound betrayal. I knew I had to put on the performance of a lifetime. If Patricia suspected I was lucid, my life was over. I put on a wrinkled robe, messed up my hair, and slowly shuffled out into the grand hallway. I made my way to the top of the sweeping mahogany staircase. I deliberately let my foot catch on the edge of the thick carpet. I stumbled, crying out in fake panic, and grabbed the handrail hard enough to rattle the wood. Patricia came rushing out of the kitchen downstairs. She wore a look of terror, a performance so convincing it made my stomach turn. She hurried up the steps, wrapping her arms around my shoulders, asking if I was hurt. I stared at her with a blank expression. I blinked slowly. I looked right into her eyes and called her by the name of my former executive secretary, a woman who retired years ago. I asked where my briefing files were. Patricia sighed, a theatrical breath of profound sadness. She patted my cheek and led me down the stairs into the kitchen. She sat me down at the island and poured a cup of black coffee. She told me my mind was just playing tricks on me again. Then she reached into the pocket of her pristine white apron. She pulled out a small, pale yellow pill. She placed it softly in the palm of my hand. She told me it was time to take my new blood pressure vitamins so I could feel better. I looked at the small yellow pill sitting in my calloused palm. It looked completely harmless. I nodded slowly, playing the obedient, confused husband. I brought the pill to my lips, threw my head back, and took a large gulp of hot coffee. But I did not swallow the pill. I tucked it deep beneath my tongue, letting the bitter coffee wash over it. I smiled at Patricia, thanking her for taking good care of me. I told her I was going to use the restroom to wash my face. I shuffled down the hallway, closed the heavy bathroom door, and locked it as silently as I could. I immediately spit the partially dissolved pill into the sink and rinsed my mouth out with cold water. I wrapped the damp pill in toilet paper and slipped it into my pocket. I waited a few minutes, then quietly made my way to my private basement workshop. Back in the day, long before I was a corporate executive, I was a chemical engineer. I still kept a sophisticated material testing kit locked in a metal cabinet above my old workbench. I took the damp yellow pill and crushed it into a fine powder using the back of a heavy wrench. I scooped a tiny sample of the powder into a glass vial and added a few drops of a reactive testing solvent. I held my breath as I gently swirled the liquid. It was supposed to turn a light pink hue if it was standard blood pressure medication. Instead, the liquid instantly turned a harsh, violent shade of dark purple. My blood ran completely cold. I knew exactly what that chemical reaction meant. I had seen it during industrial pharmaceutical testing decades ago. It was haloperidol. It was not a vitamin. It was not a blood thinner. It was a massive dose of a heavy, highly aggressive antipsychotic medication. It is a drug strictly used to chemically sedate violent, uncontrollable schizophrenic patients in locked psychiatric wards. If a healthy man took that dosage every day, it would strip away his cognitive functions, cause extreme muscle tremors, and eventually induce a fatal heart attack. My own wife was systematically melting my brain. I dumped the purple liquid down the utility drain and washed the glass vial until it was spotless. I walked back upstairs, wiping the cold sweat from my forehead. The grand house was completely silent again. I looked out the front window and saw that Derek's luxury sports car was already gone from the driveway. He normally never left for the corporate headquarters before 9 in the morning, but it was barely past 7. My chest tightened. I rushed into my study and locked the door behind me. I grabbed my encrypted cell phone hidden in the bottom drawer. I dialed the direct number for my head of corporate security. His name was Jackson. He was a former military police officer fiercely loyal to me for over 20 years. He was the only man I trusted with my life. The phone rang 3 times before Jackson answered. He sounded incredibly stressed, the loud noise of morning traffic echoing clearly in the background. Before I could even ask him what was going on, Jackson spoke. He told me he was standing in the parking lot of the main headquarters. He said his digital access badge had been completely revoked. He told me when he tried to enter the building, 2 armed private security contractors he had never seen before physically blocked his path. Jackson said the men told him that by the direct executive order of the new acting CEO, his employment was terminated immediately effective as of 6 in the morning. I felt a cold knot drop into the bottom of my stomach. Derek was not just planning to take over the company later in the week. He was accelerating the entire timeline. He was actively purging the building of anyone who was loyal to me, paving the way for his absolute control. He was securing the perimeter so no one could stop him. He was using the forged left-handed power of attorney document I had signed. I ended the call with Jackson telling him to stay out of sight completely for now. I lowered the phone, staring at the blank wall. Derek thought he had outsmarted me. He thought the heavy sedatives had scrambled my brain. He believed he was walking into my corporate headquarters today as the undisputed king of Pittsburgh, ready to tear apart my life's work. I walked over to the tall antique mirror standing in the corner. I looked at my reflection. I did not look like a senile, defeated old man anymore. The confusion and the fear were completely gone from my eyes. I reached into my closet and pulled out my darkest, sharpest tailored suit. It was the armor of a man going to war. I tied my silk tie with steady, firm hands. I slipped my gold watch onto my wrist and smoothed back my gray hair. I dropped the entire pathetic act of the dying father. I walked out of my house, ignoring Patricia, who called out my name. I got into my car, gripped the steering wheel, and drove straight toward the headquarters. I needed to see exactly how deep this terrible rot went. The towering glass and steel facade of Gallagher Heavy Industries loomed ahead of me. I pulled my car into the executive parking garage, taking a moment to steady my breathing. For 4 decades, I had walked through those sliding glass doors with absolute authority. Every security guard, every receptionist, and every engineer knew my footsteps. Today, I had to walk in as a broken, fading shadow of myself. I hunched my shoulders, softened my posture, and let a vacant, lost expression settle over my features. I pushed through the revolving doors and stepped into the sprawling, sunlit lobby. The young woman at the reception desk looked up and gasped softly. I shuffled my feet, looking around the familiar granite walls, as if I had never seen them before. I muttered something incoherent about looking for my old office. The security guards exchanged pitying glances, buying the tragic performance. They gently guided me toward the private executive elevators, assuming I was just a confused founder wandering back to his old hunting grounds. I let them, keeping my head bowed. When the elevator doors opened on the top floor, the atmosphere was completely toxic. It felt like a war zone. I stumbled out into the plush, carpeted hallway and immediately hid myself behind a large frosted glass partition near the boardroom. From the shadows, I had a perfect view of the open trading floor and my old corner office. Derek stood on a mahogany desk, his jacket-off sleeves rolled up. He looked frantic, drunk on his own stolen power. Lined up in front of him were 3 men. They were my 3 oldest, most loyal vice presidents. Men who had bled for this company when we were just scraping by. Men who had built the turbine engines that made us a global name. Derek was screaming at them. His voice echoed across the silent, terrified floor of cubicles. He told them to pack their boxes and get out of his building. One of the vice presidents tried to argue, demanding to speak to me directly. Derek laughed in his face. It was a cold, cruel sound that made my fists clench in the dark. Derek raised his voice so every single employee on the floor could hear him. He announced that my mind was completely gone. He told them the heavy sedatives had turned my brain to mush, holding sole authority over every asset. He looked out over the crowd of terrified workers and shouted that he was the law there now. Anyone who questioned him would be destroyed. I watched the 3 loyal men hang their heads and walk toward the elevators, stripped of their pensions and their dignity. I wanted to step out from behind the glass. I wanted to tear my son off that desk and throw him out the window. But I forced my feet to stay planted. If I revealed my true state of mind right now, I would lose the element of surprise. I needed hard, undeniable proof of his financial crimes. Derek jumped down from the desk and marched into my old office, leaving the door wide open. He loudly ordered the lead accountant to authorize a massive, immediate wire transfer. He was moving $40 million from our primary operational fund directly into a newly formed Cayman Islands holding company. He claimed it was an emergency restructuring maneuver, but I knew exactly what it was. It was a massive illegal bleed. He was gutting the company from the inside out, preparing to collapse the domestic accounts. I did not intervene. I waited until the terrified accountant scurried away and Derek closed his heavy office door. I slipped away from the frosted glass partition and moved silently down the back stairwell. I bypassed the security checkpoints, heading straight for the subterranean server room. Derek had spent the entire morning firing my loyalists and screaming at my executives, but in his arrogant, amateurish rush for power, he had forgotten one crucial operational detail. He had forgotten to deactivate my physical master keycard in the basement mainframe. I pulled the black card from my wallet and swiped it against the digital reader. The heavy steel door clicked open with a soft hiss. The server room was freezing cold, humming with rows of blinking lights. I sat down at the primary administration terminal and rapidly typed in my hidden backdoor credentials. My fingers flew across the keyboard with the speed and precision of a man half my age. I bypassed the security protocols and tapped directly into the outgoing financial routing system. I found the massive wire transfer Derek had just authorized. I did not stop the transfer. I needed the transaction to go through so I could trace exactly where the money was landing. I inserted a secure encrypted flash drive into the terminal and began downloading the complete offshore routing numbers, the shell company registration details, and the hidden IP addresses Derek had used. The progress bar inched across the screen. My heart pounded against my ribs. Every second I stayed in that basement increased the risk of being discovered by one of Derek's new private security thugs. The download finally completed. I pulled the drive from the machine and slipped it safely into my breast pocket. I had the digital murder weapon. I quietly locked the server room and moved back up the emergency stairwell. I needed to get back to the lobby and pretend I had just been wandering the lower floors. But as I reached the second-floor landing, I heard a strange sound. It was the soft, distinct click of a door handle turning, coming from the private executive suite just down the hall. This was the quiet, restricted wing where Derek kept his personal filing cabinets and off-the-books ledgers. I pressed my back tightly against the wall, holding my breath, and peered around the corner. The hallway was completely empty, but the heavy oak door to Derek's private suite was slightly ajar. I crept forward silently, placing my eye near the crack in the doorframe. I expected to see one of his corrupt new managers stealing company secrets. Instead, the sight completely paralyzed me. Kneeling on the floor in front of a locked fireproof steel filing cabinet was Rachel, Derek's beautiful 28-year-old bride, the woman he had married just 48 hours ago in a lavish $300,000 ceremony. She was not wearing her expensive designer clothes. She was dressed in dark, unbranded athletic gear. And she was not just looking around. She held a set of professional high-grade titanium lockpicks in her hands. I watched in absolute stunned silence as she expertly manipulated the tension wrench. She was fast, efficient, and clearly highly trained. The heavy steel lock clicked open in a matter of seconds. She pulled open the bottom drawer and began rapidly photographing the hidden financial ledgers with a specialized micro camera. My mind reeled with 1,000 questions. Why was the newlywed bride breaking into her own husband's hidden safes? Who was this woman really working for, and what exactly was she hunting for in the dark? I watched Rachel pick the heavy steel lock on my son's private filing cabinet. I desperately wanted to stay and see what documents she was photographing, but I was out of time. I had to leave headquarters immediately. I pulled my head back from the doorway and pressed my body flat against the cold hallway wall. I held my breath, listening for movement from inside the suite. The only sound was the soft clicking of her micro camera, capturing highly sensitive data. I turned and silently retraced my steps toward the emergency stairwell, moving with the caution of a man whose life depended on absolute secrecy. I slipped out through the subterranean garage and drove back to my sprawling estate. I parked, rushed inside, and immediately stripped off my sharp business suit. I put on the same wrinkled pajamas and thick wool cardigan I had worn earlier. I ruffled my gray hair and rubbed my eyes vigorously until they were red and irritated. I walked into the grand living room just as the heavy brass knocker on the front door echoed loudly through the silent house. Patricia rushed out of the kitchen, wiping non-existent tears with a pristine lace handkerchief. She opened the door to welcome our esteemed family physician. Dr. Sullivan was a highly distinguished man in his late 50s. We had played golf together every month for nearly 15 years. I had personally donated over $500,000 to fund the pediatric wing of the hospital, where he served as a board member. Seeing him walk right into my home, knowing he had been bought and paid for by my treacherous wife, filled me with a deep sense of pure revulsion. Patricia immediately grabbed his right arm, sobbing quietly into his tailored shoulder. She told him I had been wandering the empty house all morning, completely forgetting my own name and crying. Dr. Sullivan offered her a look of profound, practiced sympathy. He gently guided her toward the velvet sofa, and then walked over to where I was sitting in my favorite leather armchair. He pulled up a small wooden stool, opened his medical bag, and took out a small penlight. He asked me how I was feeling today, in a slow, patronizing tone typically reserved for very young children. I let my jaw hang slightly slack and stared blankly at the gold tie clip resting against his crisp white shirt. I knew exactly what this medical examination was. It was a carefully orchestrated deadly trap. If I answered his basic questions perfectly, proving my absolute mental clarity, Patricia would instantly realize her heavy sedatives were not working. They would both know I had discovered their sinister plot. They might instruct the doctor to forcefully inject me with a massive lethal dose of chemical restraints right there in the living room, under the false guise of an acute medical emergency. I had to play their sick game. I had to give them exactly what they wanted to see. Dr. Sullivan shined the bright light into my pupils, asking me to state my full name and the current year. I mumbled my name slowly, deliberately slurring the syllables, and told him it was 1998. Patricia let out a loud theatrical gasp, covering her mouth with both of her hands. The corrupt doctor nodded solemnly, writing a few quick notes on his thick medical clipboard. He asked me to identify a few basic objects in the room. I pointed a trembling finger at the grandfather clock and called it a television set. I looked at the marble fireplace and asked why it was snowing inside the house. Every deliberate mistake I made felt like swallowing broken glass. I was actively participating in my own legal destruction, feeding them the exact ammunition they needed to lock me away forever. Dr. Sullivan put away his penlight and pulled a stethoscope from his bag, pretending to listen to my perfectly steady heartbeat. He turned to Patricia with a heavy, deeply fabricated sigh. He told her the cognitive decline was incredibly aggressive and far more advanced than he had initially feared during his last visit. He lied effortlessly, standing right in my living room, claiming my brain was rapidly deteriorating and that I was suffering from severe, untreatable dementia. He stated I had become a critical danger to myself and to the people around me. He told Patricia that keeping me in the house was no longer a viable or safe option. He reached into his leather bag and pulled out a thick stack of medical documents printed on official hospital letterhead. Patricia cried harder, resting her head against the back of the sofa. She asked him what she was supposed to do, playing the role of the devastated, helpless wife with absolute perfection. Dr. Sullivan handed her a silver pen and the thick medical certificate. He explained that these were the official legally binding psychiatric commitment papers for Sunny Pines Asylum, a highly secure, private mental health facility located 40 miles outside the city limits. He told her that with his specialized medical authorization and her signature as my primary caregiver, the facility would dispatch a secure medical transport van to collect me first thing Friday morning. I sat completely still in the leather armchair, listening to the two of them casually finalize the complete eradication of my personal freedom. Patricia took the silver pen with trembling fingers. She signed her name at the bottom of the medical decree, officially condemning her husband of 38 years to a life sentence behind thick, locked steel doors. Dr. Sullivan gently squeezed her hand, telling her she was making the bravest, most compassionate choice possible for her beloved husband. He packed up his medical instruments, snapped his black bag shut, and walked toward the front hallway. Patricia escorted the corrupt doctor to the front door, thanking him profusely for his tremendous discretion and rapid assistance. I heard the heavy wooden door click shut and the lock engage. The grand living room fell completely silent. The theatrical weeping facade instantly vanished from Patricia's face. She wiped her dry eyes, smoothed the wrinkles from her expensive cashmere skirt, and walked slowly back toward my armchair. She looked down at me with a gaze so incredibly cold and empty, it sent a violent shiver down my spine. I kept my eyes completely vacant, staring blankly at the Persian rug beneath my slippers. She leaned down slowly, bringing her face mere inches from my ear. I could smell the familiar expensive vanilla perfume mingling with the terrifying scent of absolute malice. She smiled and whispered in a soft, mocking tone, "Do not worry, Harry. The padded walls are very comfortable. I am sure you will make plenty of new friends in the violent ward." She stood up, grabbed my arm roughly, and pulled me to my feet. She guided me up the grand staircase and pushed me into the master bedroom. The heavy oak door slammed shut in my face. I heard the distinct metallic scrape of the deadbolt sliding into place from the outside. I was officially a helpless prisoner locked in my own home. I stood in the bedroom listening to the silence. The metallic echo of the deadbolt sliding into place still rang in my ears. Patricia believed she had trapped me, a helpless old man waiting for the asylum. But she forgot one detail. I built this estate 30 years ago. I knew its hidden bones intimately. I waited until midnight, then pressed my palm against a specific knot in the oak paneling. A hidden maintenance shaft swung open. I stepped into the cold space and pulled the panel shut. I navigated the steep staircase hidden within the walls, descending directly into my subterranean wine cellar. I moved silently past the rows of expensive vintage bottles Patricia loved to flaunt at her society dinner parties. I reached the exterior service hatch, unlocked it, and stepped out into the freezing night air. I did not dare go near the main driveway or the garages. I walked through the dense, wet woods bordering the back of the estate, my tailored trousers getting soaked and muddy. I hiked for nearly 2 miles through the dark timberline until I reached the deserted county highway. A nondescript gray sedan was already waiting for me on the shoulder, idling quietly in the rain. I climbed into the passenger seat, exhausted but entirely focused. The man behind the wheel was Gregory Pearson, my fiercely loyal personal attorney. Greg had been my private legal counsel for over 2 decades. He was a brilliant, highly discreet man who had absolutely no ties to the compromised corporate legal team at my headquarters. I had called him on my encrypted phone during the brief window I was locked in the bedroom, instructing him to meet me in complete secrecy. We drove in heavy silence for 20 minutes, winding through the industrial outskirts of the city, until we reached a desolate 24-hour roadside diner. The neon sign buzzed erratically above the wet asphalt. We went inside and sat in a sticky vinyl booth in the far back corner, completely isolated from the tired truck drivers nursing their late-night meals. The waitress poured us 2 mugs of bitter black coffee and walked away. I reached into my breast pocket and pulled out the encrypted flash drive I had stolen from the server room at headquarters. I slid the small piece of plastic across the scratched laminate table. I told Greg that this drive contained the complete routing history of the offshore holding company my son was using to drain the operational accounts. I told him I needed to know exactly who was sitting at the other end of those digital transactions. Greg nodded grimly. He opened his worn leather briefcase and pulled out a heavily modified, secure laptop. He plugged the flash drive into the machine and booted up a complex financial tracing software he used for high-level asset recovery. The screen filled with scrolling lines of green data as the program worked to penetrate the layered shell companies shielding Derek's Cayman Islands account. I watched Greg's face intensely as he navigated the offshore registries. For 10 agonizing, terrifying minutes, neither of us spoke a single word to one another. The only sound was the clattering of diner silverware and the rain lashing against the dirty window beside our booth. Slowly, the color began to completely drain from Greg's face. His hands stopped typing, hovering frozen above the keyboard. He looked up at me, his eyes wide with a profound, terrifying shock. He took a shaky breath and leaned across the table. He told me that the offshore accounts were not simply holding stolen corporate funds. They were not offshore savings accounts designed to hide embezzled cash. They were aggressive debt-servicing nodes. Greg explained that my son had suffered a catastrophic financial failure in the unregulated cryptocurrency markets 18 months ago. Derek had lost tens of millions of dollars in a matter of days, completely liquidating his own personal assets. In a desperate bid to cover his massive losses and maintain his wealthy lifestyle, Derek had sought out a shadow loan from the underground market. But he did not go to a standard loan shark. Greg turned the laptop screen toward me, pointing to a series of encrypted corporate identifiers linked to the Cayman account. He told me Derek had actively borrowed $120 million from a brutal, highly organized, and notoriously violent Mexican cartel. I stared at the screen, my mind struggling to comprehend the sheer scale of the insanity. I asked Greg how a spoiled, privileged corporate executive in Pittsburgh managed to broker a massive financial deal with a violent international syndicate. Greg swallowed hard, his voice dropping to a terrified whisper. He pulled up a secondary file showing a series of charitable donations linked to the offshore accounts. He looked me right in the eye and said it was Patricia. My wife had used her prestigious, high-society charity galas as a sophisticated front to socialize with the cartel's elite money launderers. She was the one who brokered the connection. She had proudly served my son up to the wolves just to maintain her flawless social standing. The betrayal was so deep, so profoundly evil, it felt like a physical blow to my chest. They were not just greedy. They were entirely corrupt, willing to swim with murderers and thieves to fund their extravagant delusions. But the horror did not stop there. Greg began pulling up the specific terms of the shadow loan Derek had signed. Greg's hands were physically shaking as he highlighted a specific paragraph buried deep within the encrypted collateral agreement. He told me that when Derek took the $120 million from the cartel, he obviously could not use his own empty bank accounts as collateral. Instead, Derek had leveraged the entire net worth of Gallagher Heavy Industries to secure the cartel funds. But a corporate entity is not enough for a violent syndicate. They require a human life to guarantee the debt. Greg looked at me, his face pale and slick with nervous sweat. He told me that Derek had utilized the fraudulent left-handed power of attorney document to legally restructure the corporate bylaws. He had named me Harrison Gallagher as the sole personal guarantor of the massive cartel loan. My breath hitched in my throat. I looked out the diner window into the dark, rainy night, putting the terrifying pieces together. Patricia and Derek were not just locking me in a psychiatric ward to steal my wealth. They were putting me in a cage to serve as the ultimate sacrificial lamb. Greg closed the laptop, his voice cracking with sheer panic. He warned me that they were not just taking my company. They were making me the sole legally binding guarantor of a massive criminal debt. He said the cartel's payment deadline was rapidly approaching, and their terms were absolute. When the cartel came to Pittsburgh to collect their money next month, they would not look for Derek or Patricia. They would execute whoever officially owned the paper, which meant in exactly 30 days they were going to track me down and kill me. I sat in the vinyl booth of that desolate diner, letting the sheer weight of Greg's warning settle over me. My son had not just stolen my money. He had tied a $120 million cartel anchor around my neck and pushed me into the deepest ocean he could find. In exactly 30 days, a group of ruthless men from a Mexican syndicate would arrive in Pittsburgh to collect their massive debt. When they looked at the legal paperwork my son had forged, they would see my name listed as the sole guarantor. They would bypass Derek completely and come directly for me. The heavy sedatives Patricia was feeding me were not just meant to lock me in an asylum. They were meant to keep me docile and defenseless when the cartel assassins finally walked through the doors of Sunny Pines to execute me quietly in my padded cell. I looked across the table at Greg. He was wiping the cold sweat from his forehead, waiting for me to panic. But I did not panic. A profound, icy calm washed over my entire body. I told Greg to pack up his secure laptop. We were not going to run. We were going to build a guillotine. We drove straight to Greg's private law office located in a nondescript commercial building downtown. It was a secure fortress completely disconnected from the compromised legal department at my corporate headquarters. Greg locked the heavy deadbolts behind us and pulled the thick blinds tightly shut. He booted up 3 different encrypted desktop terminals. He warned me that if we tried to fight Derek in open court right now, Patricia would simply accelerate her timeline and force the corrupt doctor to commit me by tomorrow morning. I agreed completely. We could not fight them in the light. We had to destroy them entirely from the shadows. I told Greg about the thick stack of tax restructuring forms Derek had ambushed me with in the hallway earlier. I explained how I had feigned a severe muscle spasm and signed the irrevocable power of attorney document with my left hand, intentionally omitting my middle initial. Greg let out a sharp, breathless laugh of pure relief. He pulled up the founding corporate charter I had drafted 40 years ago. He highlighted the specific security clause. Because my signature was visibly altered and lacked the required initial, Derek's entire legal authority was built on a foundation of sand. The document was technically void, meaning I was still the absolute undisputed sovereign of Gallagher Heavy Industries. I sat down at the heavy oak conference table and took out my personal gold fountain pen. This time I held it firmly in my right hand. Greg began generating a massive stack of highly classified asset transfer documents. For the next 5 hours, we worked in intense, feverish silence. We created an entirely new, heavily shielded offshore financial entity. We named it the Ironclad Ghost Trust. I began signing my true, legally binding signature across dozens of pages, ensuring my middle initial was perfectly clear and prominent. With every stroke of my pen, I quietly and aggressively gutted my own empire. I transferred the total ownership of all 32 manufacturing plants into the Ghost Trust. I moved the global patents for our heavy steel turbines, the massive cash reserves, the international shipping fleets, and the commercial real estate deeds entirely out of the primary corporate structure. I was bleeding the company dry in the dead of night, legally sheltering a lifetime of immense wealth behind an impenetrable wall of anonymous offshore trusts. I was taking every single asset of actual value and locking it inside a fortress that neither my son nor his cartel backers could ever breach. But simply moving the money was not enough. I needed to ensure that when Derek proudly claimed the throne, he would be sitting on a live grenade. We deliberately left the public-facing shell of Gallagher Heavy Industries completely intact. On paper, it still looked like a sprawling billion-dollar manufacturing empire. In reality, it was a hollow, worthless husk, and inside that husk we planted a devastating poison pill. Greg accessed a highly secure, untraceable server routing network. We drafted an anonymous, incredibly detailed whistleblower report addressed directly to the Criminal Investigation Division of the Internal Revenue Service. We attached a massive cache of fabricated yet perfectly convincing internal accounting ledgers. The documents indicated that the shell company Derek was about to take over had deliberately evaded over $50 million in federal corporate taxes. We seamlessly wove the cartel debt into the fabricated tax ledgers, making it look like Derek and Patricia were the absolute masterminds of a massive international money laundering conspiracy. When the Internal Revenue Service and the violent cartel both came to collect their massive debts, they would find absolutely nothing but an empty shell owned entirely by my treacherous wife and my traitorous son. They were going to inherit a total financial apocalypse. By the time we finished encrypting the final server transfers, the sky outside the window was turning pale purple. Dawn was rapidly approaching. I shook Greg's hand, feeling a profound sense of grim satisfaction. I had successfully turned their deadly trap into their own inevitable execution. I left the office and drove back to my estate, ditching the car a mile down the road to hike back through the wet timberline. My legs ached, and my chest burned with exhaustion, but adrenaline pushed me forward. I reached the exterior service hatch of the wine cellar just as the morning birds began to sing. I unlocked the heavy metal door and stepped into the damp, subterranean room. I moved silently past the dusty racks of vintage wine, navigating by memory toward the hidden maintenance staircase. I needed to get back inside the locked master bedroom before Patricia woke up to check on her sedated prisoner. The cellar air chilled my sweat-soaked shirt as I reached the base of the wooden steps. I reached out to pull the heavy oak panel shut behind me, praying the iron hinges would not squeak. Suddenly, a harsh beam of piercing white light cut through the absolute darkness of the cellar. The beam hit me directly in the eyes, forcing me to freeze instantly in place. The flashlight blinded me, but I could hear the terrifying metallic click of a weapon safety being switched off in the pitch-black room. A dark figure stepped out from behind a row of tall mahogany barrels. My heart stopped completely in my chest. It was Rachel, my 28-year-old daughter-in-law. She was still wearing the tight, dark athletic gear I had seen her wearing when she picked the steel lock at the corporate headquarters earlier that day. She did not look like a blushing new bride. she looked like a professional killer. In her steady right hand, she held a sleek black suppressed pistol. Her grip was flawless. She raised her arm slowly in the beam of the flashlight, and the dark muzzle of the heavy weapon was aimed squarely at the exact center of my chest. The beam of the heavy flashlight blinded me completely. I stood frozen at the bottom of the wooden stairs, my hands raised slightly in the cold, damp air of the wine cellar. The dark cylindrical suppressor attached to the barrel of her pistol was pointed directly at my heart. My mind raced, trying to process how the young woman who had just cut the wedding cake with my son 48 hours ago was now holding a lethal weapon with the cold, steady grip of a seasoned professional. She did not tremble. Her breathing was perfectly controlled. She took a slow, calculated step forward, keeping the blinding light trained on my face. She spoke, and her voice was completely devoid of the sweet, high-pitched tone she had used for the past year. It was sharp, authoritative, and extremely dangerous. She asked me a very simple, chilling question. She wanted to know why the man who was supposed to be a heavily sedated, drooling vegetable was sneaking into a locked, heavily guarded subterranean wine cellar at 4 a.m. wearing muddy trousers. I swallowed hard, forcing my own voice to remain perfectly steady, despite the adrenaline pumping through my veins. I looked past the blinding light and asked her a question of my own. I asked why a supposedly naive newlywed bride was creeping around her wealthy husband's basement, holding a suppressed Glock pistol and picking steel locks at corporate headquarters. The heavy silence hung in the damp air for 10 agonizing seconds. We were two masters of deception, finally staring at each other without our masks. Slowly, she lowered the blinding beam of the flashlight toward the concrete floor. She lowered the heavy pistol, sliding it smoothly into a tactical holster secured against her hip. She reached into the back pocket of her dark athletic jacket. She pulled out a small, flat leather wallet and flipped it open. Even in the dim light of the wine cellar, I could see the heavy gold shield gleaming against the black leather. She told me her name was not Rachel. She introduced herself as Special Agent Rachel Foster with the Criminal Investigation Division of the Internal Revenue Service. I leaned back against the rough wooden frame of the secret door, letting out a long, heavy breath of pure shock. The beautiful, charming woman my son had been dating for the past 2 years was a highly trained federal operative. She explained everything in rapid, precise sentences. She had been working deep undercover to infiltrate a massive, highly violent cartel money laundering ring operating out of the Midwest. She told me that my son was not the mastermind. Derek was merely a desperate, arrogant pawn who had stumbled into a world he could not possibly comprehend. He had triggered massive red flags in the federal financial systems when he began moving unverified cryptocurrency funds 18 months ago. Rachel told me that the agency needed an operative on the inside to map the entire corporate network before the cartel washed their illegal funds through a legitimate American steel empire. So she played the part of the perfect, ambitious socialite. She made sure Derek noticed her at a charity gala. She made sure he fell in love with her. She even went through with the lavish $300,000 wedding ceremony just 2 days ago to secure her absolute unquestioned access to his private executive suites and hidden home safes. I looked at the federal agent standing in my basement. I told her I already knew about the $120 million shadow loan. I told her I knew about Patricia brokering the lethal deal with the cartel. I explained that I had just spent the entire night with my personal attorney completely gutting the operational assets of Gallagher Heavy Industries and moving everything into a secure ghost trust. I told her I had attached a $50 million federal tax evasion trap to the empty corporate shell my son was about to inherit. Rachel stared at me, a look of profound, absolute shock crossing her face. For a long, silent moment, the hardened federal agent was completely speechless, processing the sheer magnitude of the trap I had built. Then a slow, incredibly sharp smile spread across her face. She shook her head in sheer disbelief, whispering that she had spent 2 exhausting years trying to build a financial cage for these violent criminals, and I had just built a massive, fully armed guillotine in a single night. She stepped closer, her tone becoming urgent and deeply serious. She told me that the cartel was not waiting until next month to collect their collateral. The timeline had been brutally accelerated. She revealed that the highest-ranking cartel bosses were flying into Pittsburgh this coming Friday morning. They were coming to personally oversee the legal transfer of the corporate assets to settle the massive debt. Rachel explained the terrifying synchronized schedule Patricia and Derek had designed. They had arranged for the secure transport van from Sunny Pines Asylum to arrive at the estate at exactly 8:30 on Friday morning. While the medical orderlies were strapping me into a heavy canvas straitjacket and hauling me away to a locked psychiatric ward, Derek would be sitting in the downtown corporate boardroom. He would be using the forged left-handed power of attorney to sign the final legally binding documents, officially handing over the keys of my entire steel empire to a ruthless international syndicate. We stood together in the cold, damp shadows of the wine cellar, the massive weight of the impending Friday deadline pressing down on us. We both realized in that exact moment that our wildly different goals had perfectly aligned. I needed to ensure that my treacherous wife and my traitorous son took full, absolute ownership of the poisoned corporate shell I had just created. Rachel needed Derek to officially sign the cartel handover documents in the presence of the syndicate bosses to trigger a massive coordinated federal raid. We needed each other to execute the ultimate trap. I told her I could play the heavily sedated broken old man perfectly. I told her I could endure whatever humiliation Patricia and Derek threw at me over the next 48 hours. I promised her I would not break character no matter how hard they pushed me. Rachel reached out and gripped my shoulder with a firm, solid hand. Her dark eyes were fiercely determined in the dim cellar light. She told me that the federal strike teams were already on standby, waiting for her final signal to storm the estate and the corporate headquarters simultaneously. She told me we had one chance to completely obliterate the vicious people who had so carefully plotted to violently destroy my entire life. She firmly said we need them to sign the final cartel handover on Friday morning, without any hesitation whatsoever. You have to play the victim until the very last second. I stayed perfectly still on the edge of the mattress as the heavy deadbolt clicked open. It was Thursday morning, the day before my scheduled execution. The heavy oak door swung wide open, and Patricia walked into the master bedroom. She was not wearing her elegant cashmere robe or her practiced sympathetic smile. Her face was hard cold and completely stripped of all pretense. The theatrical performance she put on for the corrupt doctors and the wealthy neighbors was entirely gone. She held a steaming ceramic bowl of thick oatmeal in one hand and a heavy silver spoon in the other. She walked over to where I was sitting and stared down at me with an expression of pure, unadulterated disgust. I let my shoulders slump forward, keeping my eyes fixed on the intricate floral patterns of the Persian rug. I had to play the role of the heavily sedated broken old man she firmly believed me to be. The air in the room felt thick and suffocating as she stood over me, radiating a quiet, terrifying malice. She did not offer me the bowl. Instead, she deliberately tilted her wrist and dumped the hot, sticky oatmeal directly onto the expensive hardwood floor right at my feet. The ceramic bowl shattered into jagged white pieces against the ground, scattering sharp fragments across the expensive wood. She took a slow step back, crossing her arms over her chest. She commanded me to eat it. She told me that since my brain was melting into useless mush, I should start eating like the pathetic, mindless animal I had finally become. I did not move. I kept my breathing deliberately shallow and erratic, staring blankly at the steaming mess. Suddenly, the sharp, pointed toe of her expensive designer shoe slammed viciously into my ribs. The physical pain was sharp and immediate, forcing a genuine ragged gasp from my lungs. She kicked me again, much harder this time, striking my shin with brutal force. She leaned down, grabbing a harsh handful of my gray hair, and yanked my head backward, so I was forced to look directly into her icy, dead eyes. She mocked my entire legacy. She laughed cruelly at my rough, calloused hands, telling me that 40 years of breathing toxic steel mill smoke and breaking my back on the filthy factory floor had amounted to absolutely nothing. She openly bragged about how incredibly easy it was to slip the heavy antipsychotics into my nightly glass of bourbon. She detailed exactly how the heavy sedatives were supposed to destroy my nervous system and induce a massive fatal heart attack within the next few days once I was locked inside the asylum. She explicitly boasted about her brilliant high society connections with the cartel money launderers. She mocked me for blindly funding her extravagant charity galas, which she secretly used as a sophisticated front to broker the lethal $120 million shadow loan. She laid out her entire criminal conspiracy in vivid, boastful detail, absolutely certain that my shattered mind was far too gone to comprehend a single word she was saying. I let a thin line of drool slip from the corner of my mouth. I forced myself to sink slowly to my knees on the hardwood floor, hovering over the spilled oatmeal and the dangerous, broken ceramic shards. It took every single ounce of willpower I possessed not to rise up and wrap my hands tightly around her throat. I endured the profound, agonizing humiliation because I knew exactly what was hidden beneath my wrinkled pajama shirt. Firmly taped to the center of my chest was a highly advanced military-grade audio transmitter provided by Rachel. Every single threat, every explicit confession of poisoning, every detailed boast about the international cartel money laundering operation was being recorded and broadcast live to a secure federal server located miles away. Patricia was meticulously building her own federal indictment with every arrogant, hateful word she spoke. I stayed kneeling on the floor, enduring her vile insults, letting the digital evidence mount into an undeniable criminal case. An hour later, the heavy front doors downstairs slammed shut. Heavy, hurried footsteps echoed aggressively up the grand staircase. Derek stormed into the master bedroom. He was wearing his sharpest tailored business suit, but his silk tie was loosened and his face was deeply flushed with the arrogant thrill of stolen power. He looked down at me, kneeling helplessly on the floor amidst the spilled food and broken glass. He did not show a single ounce of pity, remorse, or basic human decency. Instead, he let out a short, cruel, barking laugh. He walked over and stood directly above my bowed head. He hawked and spit the warm saliva landing on the shoulder of my pajama shirt. He leaned down, his face contorted with greedy, impatient anticipation. He told me that he had successfully purged the final remaining loyalists from the corporate headquarters that very morning. He confidently declared that by this time tomorrow, the armed asylum transport van would carry me away forever, and he would assume absolute, unquestioned control of the entire global manufacturing empire. He looked me right in the eyes and said, "Tomorrow I am the king of Pittsburgh, old man." I kept my head bowed, staring blankly at his polished leather shoes, memorizing the exact venomous tone of his treacherous voice. The sprawling master bedroom fell completely quiet for a brief, incredibly tense moment as the two of them basked in the glory of their impending victory. But the heavy silence was abruptly shattered by the deep, aggressive crunch of heavy gravel coming from the long front driveway. Derek frowned, turning away from me, and walking quickly over to the large bay window overlooking the front estate grounds. I watched from the floor as the arrogant, triumphant smirk completely vanished from his face in a single instant. It was immediately replaced by a look of sheer, unadulterated, paralyzing terror. A massive, sleek, black armored SUV had just pulled forcefully past the main security gates. The terrifying vehicle had heavily tinted windows and no visible license plates. It rolled to a slow, menacing stop directly in front of the sweeping marble porch. 4 broad, muscular men in dark, tailored suits stepped out of the vehicle, their postures rigid, calculated, and highly disciplined. Derek stumbled backward away from the window, his breathing suddenly ragged and incredibly shallow. He looked at his mother, his voice cracking with absolute, undeniable panic. He stammered that they were not supposed to be here until Friday morning. The cartel's chief enforcer had arrived a full 24 hours early to physically inspect the collateral assets before authorizing the final transfer. The deadly shadow syndicate was standing right at our front door, demanding to see the man whose name was on the legally binding paperwork. If they discovered the truth about the forged documents right now, my ambitious, treacherous son would definitely not survive the brutal, bloody violence of this single afternoon. The massive, lethal trap I had carefully built in the absolute darkness was finally snapping shut entirely, perfectly executing the final, devastating phase of my profound revenge. The heavy gravel crunched loudly under the heavy tires of the sleek black armored vehicle parked outside. Derek stood frozen near the bedroom window, his breath coming in shallow, frantic gasps. He turned to look at me, his eyes wide with absolute primal panic. He stammered that the cartel's chief enforcer was not supposed to arrive until Friday morning, but here he was pulling up to the estate a full 24 hours early. Downstairs, the heavy brass door knocker echoed through the empty foyer. 4 men in immaculate, dark tailored suits stepped out of the black SUV. Their posture was rigid, disciplined, and terrifying. Derek looked completely lost, his arrogant corporate persona shattering into dust. He looked at Patricia, begging her to figure out a lie, but she was just as pale and terrified as he was. They knew that if the cartel's top enforcer inspected the corporate books and discovered the assets had been quietly moved into an offshore ghost trust instead of backing their shadow loan, they would not live to see the sunset. The violent syndicate did not care about family excuses. They cared about $120 million in missing collateral. I forced my body to slump back down against the hardwood floor near the broken ceramic bowl and the spilled oatmeal. I let my jaw hang slack and let out a weak, pathetic whimper to maintain the illusion of a completely broken, senile old man. Downstairs, the front door opened, and the deep, booming voice of the chief enforcer echoed up the stairwell. He demanded to see the owner of the company immediately. Derek swallowed hard, wiping the cold sweat from his forehead, and hurried out of the master bedroom to intercept the dangerous visitors in the living room. I stayed on the floor, listening intently as the heavy footsteps mounted the stairs. Moments later, Derek appeared at the doorway, flanked by 2 towering men in sharp suits. Behind them walked the chief enforcer, a terrifying individual with a scarred face, cold gray eyes, and an aura of absolute death. The enforcer looked around the master suite with deep suspicion. He stopped a few feet away from me, wrinkling his nose in disgust as he looked down at my disheveled appearance. He asked Derek if this pathetic, drooling old man was truly the sole guarantor holding the title to the entire multi-billion-dollar steel manufacturing empire. Derek forced a nervous, high-pitched laugh. He nodded quickly, telling the enforcer that my brain was completely fried from advanced dementia and heavy sedatives. He assured the dangerous visitor that I was completely neutralized, harmless, and completely unaware of what was happening around me. The enforcer stared down at me for several long, agonizing seconds. I stared right back through half-closed, vacant eyes, playing the Alzheimer's patient to absolute perfection. The enforcer grunted in deep disgust, clearly revolted by the sight of me but entirely satisfied that I posed zero threat to their operation. He turned his attention back to Derek, demanding to review the physical paperwork and confirm the asset transfer schedule. Meanwhile, Rachel, who had quietly slipped back into the house through the service entrance earlier that morning, moved like a ghost through the hallway. Dressed in her domestic housekeeper uniform, she walked into the living room carrying a silver tray with fresh drinks for the dangerous guests. As she bent down to place a heavy crystal glass on the coffee table right in front of the chief enforcer, her right hand moved with lightning speed. With absolute practiced stealth, she slipped a tiny military-grade GPS tracking device underneath the bottom leather seam of the enforcer's expensive briefcase resting on the floor. The enforcer did not notice a thing. He took a sip of the drink, completely unaware that the federal government was now digitally tracking every single movement he made. He looked across the room at Derek, his cold gray eyes narrowing into dangerous slits. He told Derek that the final $120 million transfer must happen tomorrow morning at precisely 9 o'clock in the corporate boardroom, exactly as planned. He leaned forward, resting his heavy hands on the table, and delivered a chilling, final warning that made Derek turn completely white. The enforcer stated coldly, "The $120 million transfer happens tomorrow at 9 a.m. If the paperwork isn't flawless, we don't just take your company, we take your lives." The heavy tread of the cartel enforcer's boots finally faded from the grand staircase, followed by the muffled slam of the front door. The sleek armored vehicle crunched over the gravel, carrying the Shadow Syndicate away from my estate, leaving behind a suffocating, terrifying silence. I remained on the hardwood floor of the master bedroom for a long time, listening to the frantic, hushed whispers of my wife and my son echoing from the downstairs study. They were terrified. The deadline was set. Tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock, they had to sign over the entire corporate empire, or they would pay with their lives. I slowly pushed myself up from the floor, my joints aching from the brutal kicks Patricia had delivered earlier that morning. I walked over to the heavy oak door and listened as the deadbolt clicked shut once again. I was sealed inside for the final night. The sun dipped below the tree line, plunging the sprawling bedroom into deep, absolute darkness. I did not turn on the lamps. I walked over to the heavy mahogany dresser and opened the bottom drawer. I reached far into the back and pulled out a thick, leather-bound photo album. I carried it over to the window seat, letting the pale moonlight spill across the glossy pages. I opened the heavy cover and stared at the smiling faces of the people who were currently plotting to erase me from existence. There was a photograph of Patricia from 30 years ago, holding a newborn Derek in her arms. She looked so incredibly radiant, so full of genuine maternal warmth. I remembered working a brutal 80-hour shift at the steel mill that week, just to afford the deposit on our very first house. I turned the page and saw a picture of Derek at his high school graduation. I had bought him his first car that day, a reward for his supposed hard work. I traced my calloused thumb over his smiling, youthful face. I had spent my entire adult life building a fortress of wealth and privilege around them, believing I was shielding my family from the harshness of the world. Instead, I had unknowingly funded my own executioners. I had bred a parasite in my own home, and I had married a predator who viewed my profound devotion as nothing more than a convenient financial resource. I sat in the cold moonlight and allowed myself to genuinely mourn. I wept silently, letting the hot tears trace down my weathered cheeks. I did not cry out of fear for my own life. I cried for the devastating loss of the beautiful, loving family I thought I possessed. I grieved for the 38 years of marriage that were built entirely on a foundation of expertly crafted lies. I mourned the dutiful, respectful son who simply never existed outside of my own desperate imagination. But as the hours ticked by, the hot, agonizing tears slowly began to dry. The profound grief that had been crushing my chest steadily evaporated, leaving behind a vast, hollow emptiness. I closed the heavy leather photo album with a dull, final thud. I slid it back into the dark drawer and shut it completely. In that exact moment, I systematically severed every single emotional tie I had left to those two people. I permanently extinguished the deep, unconditional love of a devoted husband and a forgiving father. Patricia and Derek were no longer my family. They were a hostile, deadly threat to my survival, and I was going to treat them with the exact same ruthless, uncompromising brutality I used to conquer the industrial steel market. The man who loved them died in that dark bedroom. Only the apex predator remained. I walked away from the dresser and sat in the leather armchair facing the window. I reached into the hidden lining of my trousers and pulled out my encrypted cellular device. The screen was dark, but a tiny pulsing blue light indicated a secure incoming transmission. I unlocked the screen and opened the heavily encrypted messaging application. It was a direct, localized transmission from Gregory Pearson, my personal attorney, coordinating smoothly with Rachel and her federal task force. The message was incredibly brief, but it contained the absolute validation of my entire counterattack. Greg confirmed that the massive, complex financial transfers we initiated during the night were completely finalized. The ironclad Ghost Trust was now fully operational permanently securing every single legitimate asset, patent, and cash reserve belonging to Gallagher Heavy Industries. The public-facing corporate shell my son was eager to claim was now officially worthless, heavily saddled with the $50 million federal tax evasion trap. Greg's final sentence made my heart pound with a grim, triumphant anticipation. He stated that the Internal Revenue Service tactical units and the Federal Bureau of Investigation strike teams were locked into their staging positions just 2 miles away from the estate. The trap was perfectly set. The guillotine was raised high into the air, its blade sharpened and ready to drop. All we needed now was for Derek and Patricia to place their own heads upon the chopping block. I deleted the secure message and powered down the encrypted device, slipping it back into its hiding place. I leaned my head against the cool leather of the armchair and stared out the large bay window. I did not sleep a single second that night. I sat perfectly still in the dark, watching the hours slowly bleed away. I watched the pitch-black sky gradually transition into a deep, bruised purple and finally into a cold, pale gray. Dawn was breaking over the sprawling, silent estate. It was Friday morning, the day of my scheduled destruction and the day of my ultimate revenge. The house began to wake up around me. I heard the muffled, hurried footsteps of Patricia walking down the hallway. I could hear the faint, nervous voice of my son pacing in the study downstairs, likely rehearsing the lies he would tell the cartel bosses in the boardroom in just a few short hours. They were moving quickly, executing the final meticulous steps of their sinister conspiracy. I stood up from the armchair, stretching my stiff, aching muscles. I smoothed out the wrinkles in my plain pajamas, preparing to deliver the absolute greatest acting performance of my entire life. I had to play the terrified, helpless victim one last time. I walked toward the center of the bedroom and waited in the profound, heavy silence. Then it happened. Breaking through the quiet morning air, I heard the distinct heavy rumble of a large commercial diesel engine turning off the main road. The heavy tires crunched slowly and aggressively up the long gravel driveway. I walked back to the window and looked down. A massive, reinforced white transport van with barred windows pulled to a harsh stop directly in front of the marble porch. Painted on the side of the vehicle were the words, "Sunny Pines Care Facility." It was time. I watched the 2 massive orderlies step out of the heavy transport van. They were built like professional bouncers, wearing thick gray uniforms and carrying a heavy canvas straitjacket. My chest tightened, but not from fear. It was the absolute focused clarity of a man who was about to spring the ultimate trap. I turned away from the window and walked slowly down the grand staircase, forcing my hands to tremble and my knees to buckle slightly. I needed them to believe the illusion until the very last second. Every single step I took down those polished wooden stairs felt like a deliberate march toward my own liberation. I could hear the loud sound of the heavy brass knocker pounding aggressively against the solid oak front door. Patricia practically sprinted out of the formal dining room, clutching a pristine white lace handkerchief tightly against her chest. She threw open the heavy wooden door and immediately burst into loud theatrical tears. It was a masterful, sickening performance. She wailed about how her beloved husband had completely lost his mind, shouting loud enough for the wealthy neighbors stepping out for their morning walks to hear every calculated word. She stood on the marble porch and told the orderlies that I had become dangerously violent and unpredictable during the night. She painted a tragic, sympathetic picture of a devoted wife forced to make an agonizing medical decision for the safety of her family. I reached the bottom of the staircase and stood in the grand foyer, letting my shoulders slump forward in a posture of utter defeat. I kept my eyes completely vacant, staring aimlessly at the intricate patterns woven into the expensive Persian rug, waiting patiently for the right moment. Derek walked out of his private study, wearing a sharp, custom-tailored business suit. His silk tie was perfectly knotted, and his leather shoes were immaculately shined. He was ready to drive downtown to the corporate boardroom and confidently sign the final cartel handover the absolute moment I was hauled away. He looked at me standing in my wrinkled pajamas and sneered with absolute unchecked arrogance. There was no hesitation in his eyes, no lingering guilt about sending his own father to die in a locked psychiatric ward. He pointed a firm finger directly at my chest and aggressively directed the two towering orderlies standing in the doorway. He told them that I was highly dangerous, completely unpredictable, and entirely unaware of my surroundings. He ordered them to strap me up extremely tight, ensuring I could not thrash around and hurt myself during the long drive to the asylum. The orderlies stepped into the grand foyer with heavy footsteps. They did not speak to me or offer any words of comfort. They did not treat me like a human being. To them, I was simply a lucrative, high-risk patient who needed to be restrained and transported as efficiently as possible. They grabbed me roughly by the arms, their thick fingers digging painfully into my biceps. One of them shoved the heavy canvas straitjacket against my chest, forcefully, attempting to guide my right arm into the reinforced sleeve. Out on the porch, Patricia continued to weep loudly, securing her alibi for the audience of curious neighbors slowly gathering on the sidewalk. Derek proudly crossed his arms over his chest, thoroughly savoring his ultimate victory. He was convinced that he had officially conquered his father, stolen his wealth, and secured his own future. He believed the empire was his to command. I let the aggressive orderly push my arm halfway into the thick, suffocating canvas sleeve. I kept my head lowered, staring silently at the polished hardwood floor, feeling the heavy restrictive material pressing against my skin. I waited for the exact, perfect moment to strike. Then I closed my eyes and took one slow, deep, perfectly controlled breath. The terrified, broken, senile old man completely vanished into thin air. I stopped shaking entirely. My posture, which had been deliberately slumped and physically broken for the past 48 hours, instantly snapped into rigid, terrifying, and absolute alignment. I pulled my arms backward with a sudden explosive surge of sheer physical strength that absolutely shocked the two massive orderlies. I planted my bare feet firmly on the cold marble floor, stood up perfectly straight, and stared directly into the eyes of the towering man, attempting to secure the heavy canvas jacket. My gaze was incredibly cold, exceptionally sharp, and entirely lucid. I shook off their heavy, aggressive hands with a terrifying, undeniable authority that instantly demanded absolute obedience. I calmly reached up, adjusted the wrinkled collar of my pajama shirt, and smoothly flattened the messy fabric over my chest. I looked right past the deeply stunned medical workers and locked my eyes squarely on my treacherous, arrogant son, standing a few feet away. I watched him process the horrifying reality that I was completely in control. The smug, triumphant smile instantly melted right off Derek's face. The blood drained completely from his cheeks, leaving him looking sickly and incredibly pale. He stumbled backward in sheer disbelief, his polished leather shoes scraping loudly against the pristine hardwood floor. He looked at my perfectly steady hands, my rigidly straight posture, and my sharp, intensely focused eyes with a profound, paralyzing terror. He stammered desperately, unable to form a single coherent sentence. He could not comprehend how the heavily sedated man he had just spat upon was now standing before him with the lethal presence of a corporate apex predator. Out on the marble porch, Patricia stopped her sobbing performance entirely. She dropped the lace handkerchief onto the wet stone, her jaw falling open in absolute shock. The flawless illusion was completely shattered in a heartbeat. She realized in a horrifying instant that the lethal antipsychotic sedatives had never actually entered my bloodstream. She realized that I had been completely awake and fully aware of every single treacherous thing they had plotted against me in the dark. She gasped loudly, her carefully constructed composure fracturing into a million jagged pieces. Her voice cracked with sheer desperate panic as she yelled my name, demanding to know what I was doing and how I was standing there perfectly sane. She screamed wildly at the two bewildered orderlies, forcefully commanding them to grab me immediately and aggressively force me into the heavy canvas jacket before I could do anything else to ruin her masterful plan. The massive men stepped forward hesitantly, raising their thick hands to aggressively subdue me and complete their contractual transport job. I did not step back. I did not flinch or show a single ounce of fear. I just stood my ground in the center of my grand foyer and smiled a remarkably cold, deeply ruthless smile. Before the orderlies could even lay a single heavy finger on my shoulders, the clear, quiet morning air was violently and abruptly ripped apart. The deafening, aggressive roar of heavy tactical helicopters suddenly thundered directly over the high roof of the sprawling estate. The ground physically shook as the loud, incredibly powerful engines of massive, heavily armored federal vehicles came tearing aggressively up the long, curving gravel driveway. I stood in the center of the grand foyer, completely unmoving. 5 black tactical vans from the Federal Bureau of Investigation, flanked by heavily armored vehicles from the Internal Revenue Service's Criminal Investigation Division, had completely surrounded the front of the estate. Heavily armed federal agents wearing dark tactical gear poured out of the vehicles, swarming the meticulously manicured lawn and rapidly securing the entire perimeter. The deafening, aggressive roar of a tactical helicopter, hovering low over the roof, violently rattled the expensive crystal chandelier hanging above my head. The 2 massive orderlies who had been attempting to force me into the canvas straitjacket immediately backed away, raising their empty hands high into the air in a posture of complete, absolute surrender. Derek stumbled backward onto the marble porch, his sharp, tailored suit suddenly looking incredibly small against the overwhelming federal presence. He began screaming frantically at the heavily armed agents advancing up the wide front steps. He waved his arms wildly, completely unhinged, shouting that they had absolutely no right to be there. He yelled that he officially owned the estate and the entire multi-billion-dollar steel company. He screamed that he held an irrevocable, legally binding power of attorney, demanding that the agents back down immediately. The lead tactical team did not even slow their pace. They moved with absolute terrifying precision, aiming their high-powered rifles directly at my treacherous son. From the passenger seat of the lead FBI command vehicle, a familiar figure stepped calmly out into the chaos. It was Gregory Pearson, my fiercely loyal personal attorney. He casually adjusted his silk tie and walked confidently up the marble steps, completely unfazed by the screaming and the heavy weaponry. He stopped a few feet away from Derek and pulled a crisp white legal document from the inner pocket of his jacket. Greg looked at my son with a remarkably calm, deeply satisfied expression. He told Derek that he was unfortunately incorrect. Greg explicitly stated that the irrevocable power of attorney document Derek was trying to leverage was entirely void. He explained in a clear, authoritative voice that I had deliberately signed the crucial document using my non-dominant left hand, purposely omitting my middle initial. According to the strict corporate charter governing Gallagher Heavy Industries, any executive transfer lacking that specific initial was instantly and entirely invalid. Derek and Patricia froze completely, processing the devastating legal reality that had just destroyed their entire conspiracy. They slowly turned their heads, looking past the federal agents and the shattered ceramic bowl on the floor, locking their terrified eyes directly onto me. I stood perfectly straight in the grand foyer, adjusting the wrinkled cuffs of my pajama shirt with a slow, deliberate motion. I looked right back at the 2 people who had so eagerly plotted to lock me away and slowly smirked. The profound silence that fell over the front lawn was heavier than lead. The deafening roar of the tactical helicopter above seemed to fade into the background as I slowly descended the marble steps of the grand porch. My bare feet stepped past the shattered pieces of the ceramic bowl and the cold oatmeal Patricia had dumped on the floor just 24 hours ago. I did not look at the heavily armed federal agents surrounding the perimeter. I did not look at the flashing red and blue lights reflecting off the wet grass. My eyes were locked entirely on the woman I had called my wife for 38 years. Patricia was trembling violently. Her flawless high society facade had completely dissolved into a mask of pure, unadulterated terror. She clutched the collar of her expensive cashmere robe, her knuckles completely white. I stopped mere inches from her trembling face. I looked deep into her panicked, tear-filled eyes. I spoke in a voice so quiet and utterly devoid of emotion that it made her flinch. I said you wanted the shell of my company, Patty. It is completely yours. I hope you and our son enjoy every single piece of the magnificent empire you plotted so carefully to steal. Derek let out a ragged, desperate gasp. He lunged forward, pointing a shaking finger at my chest. He screamed that I was bluffing. He yelled that he had officially submitted the signed power of attorney to the corporate legal department yesterday afternoon. He insisted that he was the newly minted chief executive officer and the absolute legal owner of Gallagher Heavy Industries. Greg Pearson, standing calmly beside the lead federal agent, let out a short, hollow laugh. He stepped forward, opening the pristine white legal folder he carried. Greg looked at my arrogant, trembling son with an expression of absolute withering pity. He told Derek to listen very closely to the precise legal mechanics of his own profound stupidity. Greg explained that because the power of attorney was signed with a deliberately invalid left-handed signature, missing the required corporate initial, Derek never actually possessed a single ounce of legal authority over the company. Therefore, when Derek confidently signed the massive $120 million shadow loan agreement with the Mexican cartel yesterday afternoon, he was not legally representing Gallagher Heavy Industries. He was signing the paperwork entirely as a private citizen. The color completely drained from Derek's face. He stopped breathing, his mouth hanging open in sheer paralyzed horror. Greg continued, his voice projecting clearly across the silent lawn. He explicitly stated that the massive cartel debt was not attached to my corporate assets, because those assets had been legally transferred into a highly secure, untouchable offshore ghost trust 48 hours prior. Instead, Derek had unknowingly bound the entire $120 million criminal debt directly to his own personal Social Security number. But the trap did not stop there. Greg turned to Patricia, who was now shaking so severely she could barely stand. He informed her that the empty corporate shell they had conspired to steal was currently carrying a staggering $50 million federal tax evasion penalty. Because Patricia had legally co-signed the initial corporate transfer documents as the primary beneficiary, that massive federal tax debt was now permanently anchored to her personal identity. They had not stolen a billion-dollar manufacturing empire. They had voluntarily inherited total, inescapable financial annihilation. The absolute magnitude of their catastrophic failure hit them like a physical shockwave. They had spent months carefully poisoning me, bribing corrupt medical professionals, and coordinating with a violent international syndicate, all to secure a fortune that had vanished into thin air long before they even made their final move. They were entirely bankrupt, heavily wanted by the federal government, and solely responsible for a 9-figure debt to the most ruthless killers on the continent. Patricia suddenly snapped. A primal, horrifying shriek ripped out of her throat. It was not the theatrical crying she had performed for the neighbors earlier. It was the desperate, animalistic scream of a cornered predator realizing she was caught in a lethal trap. She lunged forward with her hands raised, her manicured fingernails aiming directly for my eyes. She wanted to tear my face apart. She did not even make it 2 steps. A massive tactical agent from the Federal Bureau of Investigation stepped seamlessly into her path. He grabbed her aggressively by the shoulders, spun her around, and slammed her face first against the hood of the black tactical van. She screamed and thrashed wildly, kicking her expensive shoes against the metal doors, but the agent smoothly locked her wrists behind her back and secured a heavy pair of steel handcuffs. He read her Miranda rights in a loud, booming voice, officially charging her with federal tax evasion, criminal conspiracy, and attempted murder. I turned my gaze away from my screaming wife and looked down at my son. Derek was not fighting the federal agents. He was not shouting about his lawyers or demanding his rights. The arrogant, untouchable corporate prince had completely shattered into a pathetic, broken shell. The terrifying realization of his exact predicament had finally crushed his mind. He knew the federal agents were going to put him in a concrete prison cell, but he also knew that federal prison would not protect him from the people he had just defrauded. The cartel did not care about invalid signatures or corporate ghost trusts. They only cared about their missing $120 million, and Derek was the man who had promised to deliver it. Derek dropped heavily to his knees on the wet, manicured grass. He wrapped his arms around his stomach, doubling over, as violent, uncontrollable tremors racked his entire body. He let out a loud, agonizing retch and vomited a foul mixture of bile and expensive morning coffee directly onto the pristine lawn. He gasped for air, weeping hysterically, begging the federal agents to protect him from the cartel. He looked up at me, his eyes wide with absolute pathetic desperation, pleading for me to fix the massive mistake he had made. I looked down at the weeping, vomiting coward kneeling in the dirt. I felt absolutely nothing. No pity, no remorse. The man who would have loved him died the moment I watched that security footage in the basement of the restaurant. Suddenly, the harsh crackle of encrypted radio traffic erupted from the shoulder-mounted communication device of the lead tactical commander standing near the porch. The commander pressed his hand against his earpiece, listening intently to the rapid transmission coming from the coordinated strike teams positioned across the city. A hard, satisfied smile spread across his face. He looked over at Greg and gave a sharp, definitive nod. He announced loudly that the secondary phase of the entire operation was a complete success. The heavily armored vehicle carrying the cartel enforcer was violently intercepted by armed federal units. The enforcer was secured in federal custody. At the exact same moment, tactical teams successfully breached the corporate boardroom, simultaneously arresting the vicious cartel bosses. The cool morning air was completely shattered by the wailing sirens and the chaotic overlapping shouts of federal agents securing the perimeter. My sprawling, manicured front lawn had been transformed into a heavily militarized staging ground in a matter of seconds. The towering ancient oak trees that had shaded this estate for decades now stood as silent witnesses to the absolute destruction of my family. I stood perfectly still on the marble steps, watching the devastating reality finally crush the two people who had so eagerly plotted my demise. Derek was still on his knees in the wet grass, trembling violently, his expensive suit stained with dirt and his own sickness. Patricia was pinned against the side of the black tactical van, her face pressed hard against the cold, dark metal. Her perfectly styled hair had completely unraveled, falling in messy, frantic strands across her terrified face. She was breathing in heavy, ragged gasps, her mind desperately and frantically searching for any possible viable escape route from the catastrophic financial and legal apocalypse rapidly closing in all around her. She twisted her head, her wild, panicked eyes scanning the chaotic scene until they landed on a figure standing quietly near the edge of the marble porch. It was Rachel. She was standing perfectly still, her hands resting calmly by her sides, watching the federal raid unfold with an expression of profound, chilling detachment. Patricia did not understand. She still believed she was the matriarch of a powerful, untouchable dynasty. She still believed her newlywed daughter-in-law was just another spoiled, obedient socialite, eager to protect her newfound wealth. Patricia thrashed violently and aggressively against the unbreakable iron grip of the towering federal agent holding her arms pinned behind her back. She screamed across the lawn, her voice cracking with sheer desperate authority. She commanded Rachel not to just stand there like a useless idiot. She ordered her to run inside the house, find her encrypted cellular phone, and immediately call their high-powered corporate defense lawyers. Rachel did not flinch. She did not rush toward the heavy wooden front doors to obey the frantic commands of the woman who was supposed to be her new mother-in-law. Instead, she took a slow, deliberate step down from the elevated marble porch. Her movements were incredibly smooth, highly calculated, and entirely devoid of the nervous, eager energy she had carefully projected for the past 2 years. She calmly walked past the shattered, jagged pieces of the ceramic bowl and the cold, spilled oatmeal resting on the porch. She smoothly walked past the 2 massive medical orderlies, who were now sitting silently on the ground, with their hands firmly secured behind their heads. She moved gracefully across the wet, perfectly trimmed grass, stepping right into the absolute center of the federal raid. The armed tactical agents did not stop her. They did not raise their weapons or shout commands for her to freeze. They simply parted ways, creating a clear, respectful path for her to approach the center of the lawn. Derek was still kneeling in the dirt, clutching his stomach and weeping uncontrollably. He looked up through his blurry, tear-filled eyes as his beautiful young bride stopped directly in front of him. He reached out a shaking, pathetic hand, desperately grasping at the pristine fabric of her designer trousers, silently begging her for comfort or some kind of miraculous salvation. Rachel looked down at him with a gaze so incredibly cold and empty that it made my own blood run cold. She did not offer him her hand. She did not speak a single word of comfort. She slowly raised her left hand, extending her fingers into the cool morning air. Resting on her ring finger was the massive, flawless, custom-designed diamond wedding ring Derek had purchased for her just a few short months ago. It was a ring that cost well over $100,000, paid for with the stolen, laundered money of a violent international syndicate. With absolute terrifying calmness, Rachel reached over with her right hand and pinched the heavy platinum band of the diamond ring. She pulled it smoothly over her knuckle, completely sliding the extravagant piece of jewelry off her finger. She held the sparkling diamond in the air for a brief, agonizing second, letting it catch the bright reflection of the flashing red and blue police lights illuminating the estate. Then she opened her fingers and simply let it fall. The heavy ring dropped right into the trembling lap of Derek, tumbling off his knee and landing in the wet, muddy grass beside his expensive leather shoes. Derek stared down at the discarded symbol of their marriage, his mind completely fracturing under the weight of the profound rejection. He looked back up at her, utterly paralyzed with confusion. Rachel reached into the deep inner pocket of her expensive designer leather purse. She did not pull out a cell phone or a list of corporate defense attorneys. She pulled out a small, flat, black leather wallet. She flipped it open with a highly sharp, practiced flick of her right wrist, revealing a heavy, gleaming gold federal shield resting proudly against the dark leather. She held the federal badge up high, ensuring that both Derek and Patricia had a perfectly clear, undeniable view of the ultimate deception. Her voice rang out across the manicured lawn, carrying a sharp, authoritative tone that echoed with absolute finality. She announced her true identity to the people she had flawlessly manipulated for 24 agonizing months. Special Agent Rachel Vance, you are both under arrest for conspiracy to commit murder, federal tax evasion, and international money laundering. The devastating reality of her true identity hit them like a catastrophic physical blow. The absolute perfection of the federal sting operation finally settled into their treacherous minds. The lavish wedding, the romantic vacations, and the endless charity galas had all been an elaborate, deadly cage slowly closing around them. And the moment the steel handcuffs were forcefully snapped onto their wrists, the fragile, greedy alliance between mother and son completely vaporized into thin air. There was no loyalty among predators when the trap finally sprang shut. Patricia instantly turned her head, screaming wildly and frantically at the surrounding federal agents that the entire massive criminal operation was exclusively the idea of her son. She wailed that Derek had forced her into communicating with the cartel to cover his massive, pathetic cryptocurrency debts. Derek snapped his head up, pointing a shaking, furious finger at his mother. He screamed through his tears, violently blaming Patricia for acquiring the lethal sedatives and plotting the elaborate poisoning scheme. He yelled that she was the true monster who desperately wanted to lock his father in a remote psychiatric asylum. I stood quietly on the top step of the porch, watching the pathetic, ugly facade of their unholy alliance crumble into desperate, cowardly backstabbing. The armed agents aggressively shoved my screaming wife and weeping son into the back of the dark police cruisers. I watched the heavy metal doors slam shut, feeling a strange, overwhelming mixture of profound, agonizing grief and absolute, undeniable, permanent liberation. 1 week had passed since the tactical raid shattered my estate. I drove through the heavy iron gates of the Federal Detention Center just outside the city limits. The sky above was a brilliant blue contrasting with the towering gray concrete walls and razor wire fences. I parked and walked toward the main visitor entrance. My leather shoes echoed against the sterile linoleum floors of the processing lobby. I surrendered my personal belongings to the stern correctional officers, keeping only my identification and a single item I had specifically brought. I passed through 3 electronic security checkpoints, the heavy steel doors locking decisively behind me. I was escorted into a bleak, windowless visitation room, divided perfectly in half by a thick pane of bulletproof glass. The air smelled of harsh chemical bleach and profound despair. I sat down on the cold metal chair, resting my hands on the narrow counter. A heavy door on the opposite side of the glass swung open, and the 2 people who had eagerly plotted to end my life were escorted into the harsh fluorescent light. The flawless high society facade had completely vanished, replaced by the grim, humiliating reality of federal incarceration. Patricia was wearing an oversized, faded orange jumpsuit that hung loosely over her shrinking frame. Her perfectly dyed hair had lost its expensive luster, revealing stark gray roots. Her face was pale, deeply lined with exhaustion, and her eyes were wide with a frantic, desperate energy. Derek walked slightly behind her, his shoulders slumped forward in a posture of crushing defeat. He looked remarkably small, stripped of his expensive tailored suits and his aggressive, entitled swagger. His hands trembled noticeably as he sat down in the metal chair beside his mother. He could not even bring himself to look me directly in the eyes. He kept his gaze firmly fixed on the scuffed surface of the visitation counter. Patricia immediately pressed her hands flat against the thick, bulletproof glass. She leaned forward, her face contorted into a mask of profound, manufactured sorrow. She was ready to deliver one final, desperate performance, hoping to manipulate the man she had spent nearly 4 decades expertly deceiving. She picked up the black plastic telephone receiver mounted on the wall. I slowly lifted my own receiver. Her voice crackled through the secure line, thick with fabricated tears and trembling with calculated emotion. She called me her beloved husband. She begged me to listen, pleading that everything that happened was a catastrophic misunderstanding. She wept, detailing the 38 years we had spent building a life together. She brought up the early days of our marriage, the long nights I worked at the steel mill, and the profound sacrifices we had supposedly made as a united team. She claimed she had been horribly manipulated by the terrifying cartel members, forced into compliance under the severe threat of brutal violence. She sobbed loudly, insisting that she still loved me deeply, and that she was only trying to protect our family from absolute ruin. She begged me to speak with the federal prosecutors, to leverage my immense wealth to secure a lenient plea deal for her. She promised me that if I just saved her from this concrete nightmare, she would spend the rest of her natural life making it up to me. I did not say a single word. I stared at her through the smudged glass, my expression entirely devoid of sympathy. Seeing that her emotional manipulation was crashing against an impenetrable wall of absolute indifference, Patricia lowered the receiver, her fake tears instantly drying up. She shoved the plastic phone toward Derek. My son took the receiver with shaking hands. He swallowed hard, his voice barely a weak, pathetic whisper. He did not apologize for attempting to steal my manufacturing empire. He did not express a single ounce of genuine remorse for casually planning to lock his father in a remote psychiatric asylum. Instead, the deeply ingrained arrogance of his privileged upbringing leaked through his terror. He begged me to transfer funds to a private legal defense account. He whined that the court-appointed public defenders were incompetent, and that he desperately needed high-powered corporate attorneys to fight the staggering tax evasion and international money laundering charges. He pleaded with me to liquidate a portion of the secure offshore ghost trust, arguing that I owed him a robust legal defense simply because he was my only child. He told me that if I did not pay for the best lawyers, he would spend 20 years in a federal penitentiary. I listened to his greedy demands, feeling a cold, dark satisfaction settle deep within my chest. I gently placed the plastic receiver down on the narrow metal counter. I reached into the breast pocket of my tailored suit jacket and pulled out my encrypted cellular device. I unlocked the screen, accessed the secure audio files, and pressed play. I held the speaker of the phone directly against the communication microphone mounted in the bulletproof glass. The crystal-clear, high-definition audio recording of their secret conversation in the bridal suite filled the silent visitation room. Patricia and Derek were forced to sit there and listen to their own voices, plotting my complete destruction. They heard themselves laughing cruelly about my supposed dementia. They heard Patricia explicitly boasting about lacing my evening bourbon with heavy lethal antipsychotic sedatives. They heard Derek complaining bitterly about the exorbitant cost of his lavish wedding and demanding absolute control over my massive financial trust. The horrific, undeniable evidence of their profound evil echoed through the thick glass, completely shattering any remaining illusion of innocence. The color rapidly drained from both of their faces as they realized I had captured every single treacherous word they had spoken. I stopped the audio playback and slipped the encrypted device back into my pocket. I looked at the two terrified strangers sitting on the other side of the partition. I slowly reached into my wallet and pulled out a single crumpled $1 bill. I smoothed out the wrinkled paper with deliberate, agonizing slowness. I folded the dollar bill in half and slid it through the narrow metal transaction slot located at the bottom of the bulletproof glass. The green paper rested quietly on the steel counter, right in front of Derek. I picked up the plastic receiver one last time. I looked directly into my son's panicked, weeping eyes and spoke in a voice so cold it practically froze the air between us. I said, "Here is your entire inheritance, Derek. Buy yourself a cheap cup of coffee." I hung up the phone before he could utter another pathetic, desperate word. I turned my back on the woman I had married and the son I had raised. I walked out of the bleak, windowless visitation room, ignoring their frantic, muffled screams echoing behind the heavy steel doors. I stepped out of the grim federal detention center directly into the bright, warming, beautiful afternoon sunlight. I took a deep breath of the crisp, clean, fresh air. I had successfully burned my entire treacherous past to the ground, finally securing my absolute, undeniable, and permanent freedom. 6 months have passed since the day I walked out of that federal detention center and left my former life behind. I am currently sitting on the polished teak deck of a brand-new custom-built luxury yacht, anchored quietly in the warm, crystal-clear waters of the Florida Keys. The gentle ocean breeze carries the scent of salt and freedom. The brilliant afternoon sun warms my skin completely, chasing away the bitter, lingering cold of that final Pittsburgh morning. I am 70 years old, and for the first time in nearly 4 decades, I am breathing with absolute, unburdened clarity. The transition was not without its turbulent moments, but my empire survived the storm. The incredibly complex, ironclad ghost trust that Greg and I built in the dead of night functioned flawlessly. Once the dust from the massive federal raid finally settled, I seamlessly transferred the clean, legitimate assets back into a newly structured, legally impenetrable corporate holding. I completely purged the executive board, promoting the fiercely loyal men and women who had stood by my side when Derek attempted to cast them out. Under their dedicated, honest management, our production output has actually increased. The business is thriving, free from the toxic, parasitic greed that had secretly infected its roots for years. I hear the soft, rhythmic hum of a small motorboat approaching the starboard side of the yacht. I stand up and walk over to the polished railing. A sleek white water taxi pulls alongside my vessel, and a familiar figure agilely steps aboard. It is Rachel. She is dressed casually in light canvas trousers and a simple white linen shirt, looking nothing like the heavily armed federal agent who raided my estate, and completely distinct from the shallow, materialistic bride she pretended to be. She walks up the teak steps to the upper deck, carrying a small condensation-covered cooler. We do not hug. We do not exchange hollow, sentimental pleasantries. We share a bond forged in absolute high-stakes survival, a mutual respect built entirely on our successful, devastating deception. She opens the cooler and hands me an ice-cold bottle of domestic beer. I take it, feeling the freezing glass against my calloused palm. We stand side by side at the railing, looking out over the vast, sparkling expanse of the open ocean. Rachel takes a slow sip of her drink and tells me that the federal prosecutors have officially secured the convictions. Patricia and Derek accepted binding non-negotiable plea deals to avoid a lengthy, highly publicized trial. They are both facing over 2 decades in maximum security federal penitentiaries, completely stripped of their wealth, their high society status, and their arrogant pride. Furthermore, the violent cartel bosses who arrived to claim my empire were successfully indicted on a massive cascade of international racketeering and conspiracy charges, entirely dismantling their shadow financial network. I raise my cold bottle into the salty air. Rachel raises hers. We clink the glass bottles together, the sharp, clear sound ringing out over the quiet water. We toast to a perfectly executed operation. We toast to absolute, uncompromising justice. Rachel finishes her drink, gives my shoulder a firm, respectful squeeze, and climbs back down into the waiting water taxi. I watch the small boat speed away, cutting a long white wake across the endless blue horizon. I am alone again, but I do not feel a single ounce of loneliness. I lean heavily against the wooden railing and let out a long, peaceful breath. I lost the woman I thought was my devoted wife. I lost the boy I thought was my loving son. But looking back, I realize I never actually had them. They were simply brilliant, terrifying illusions. They believed my silent patience was a symptom of senile weakness. They thought my profound paternal devotion made me a soft, easily manipulated target. They forgot that I built a global empire from nothing but dirt, sweat, and raw, unforgiving ambition. I am no longer a victim trapped in a treacherous, gilded cage. I kept my soul entirely intact. I preserved my hard-earned dignity, and I protected the massive empire I bled to build. I am the apex predator who survived the harshest, most brutal winter imaginable, and I will spend the rest of my days living exactly as I choose, completely unbound and entirely free. Do not confuse the silent patience of a father with senile weakness. When you build an empire from dirt and sweat, your instincts never truly dull. They merely sleep until threatened. Blood may bind us, but greed severs that bond faster than any blade. Never hand over the keys to your kingdom to those who have not bled to build it. Trust is earned through loyalty, not demanded by birthright. If someone shows you they are willing to dig a grave for you, do not weep. Instead, simply hand them the heavy shovel, step back, and watch them bury themselves. If this story of ultimate betrayal and absolute justice made your blood pump, hit that subscribe button right now. Have you ever had to cut a toxic person out of your life to survive? Drop your story in the comments below. Let us build a community of survivors. Stay strong.